Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
They told me they could not help with rent because I needed to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet, and then in the same breath they bragged about paying off my brother's credit card balance so he could start fresh. And I remember thinking that if fairness had a sound, it would be the click of a door closing, because in that moment something shut inside me that had been open since I was a kid who kept trying to be easy to love. And what came rushing in behind it was not rage or tears, but a cold, steady clarity that sounded like my own voice finally saying, "Stop asking." It was not even a dramatic conversation, which almost made it worse, because the calm tone they used to tell me there was no money for my rent while I finished school was the same tone they used to ask if I could still swing by on weekends to help with errands. And when my mother said the words, "We just cannot enable you," I had to choke back a laugh that would not have sounded kind, because I had paid my own phone plan since I was a teenager. I had picked up shifts and taken on tutoring and sold my old textbooks online just to keep the lights on, yet somehow I had become the one who needed a lesson in responsibility, while my brother, who treated bills like suggestions, was rewarded with a clean slate and a round of applause for promising to be better next month. I did not cry, and I did not argue, because I had already tried both, and they had never moved the needle, so instead I listened to the story they told themselves about me, the one where I was always on the edge of being a burden. And I let them hear the silence that came after it, which made my father ask if I was upset and made my mother add that they loved me and believed in me, words that would have mattered if they had been backed by even a small measure of the faith they kept handing to my brother like a coupon that never expired. If you want to know what humiliation tastes like, it is not big scenes and slammed doors. It is the way your voice gets small when you tell your landlord you will find a way. It is the way you rehearse lines in your head for a call you never wanted to make. And it is the way you pretend to be surprised when a parent explains that helping you would set a bad precedent, because deep down you already knew the precedent was set years ago when every family emergency became your problem to solve, while your brother's disasters were always framed as opportunities for growth. I went home to my tiny place and did the math with a pencil because there is something grounding about scratching numbers onto paper until the page looks like proof that you tried. And then I put the pencil down and stared at the ceiling and realized I was done auditioning for a part one was never going to get, which freed up a kind of energy I had not felt in years. An energy that said I did not need them to be different for my life to be different. The next morning my mother texted a photo of my brother holding a cake with the words, "Fresh start," iced across it like a joke that only some people were allowed to laugh at, and I typed a long message and deleted it, then typed a shorter one and deleted that too, and finally sent a line that looked polite but felt like a boundary, telling her I would not be available that weekend to help with anything around the house, and that I had some things to take care of, which was true in the way that a locked door is true. A few hours later my father called to suggest I move back in for a bit to save money, and I had to sit on my hands to keep from clapping at the logic, because they would not help with rent, but were happy to invite me into a situation where I would go back to doing free labor and pretending not to hear the comments about how school was a luxury and how practical people get jobs and pull their weight. So I told him gently that moving back was not an option and that I had it handled, and when he said he hoped I was not angry, I said I was not, which was honest in a way he might not understand, because anger would have meant I still expected them to behave like parents to me. You want the moment of revenge, the first one, the one that is so small it almost does not register until you realize how sharp it is, and here it is. I opened my bank app and removed my card from the household grocery account that I had quietly funded for years whenever things were tight. And then I canceled the auto pay I had set for a couple of their utilities during a stretch when they said they were overwhelmed, and I did not send a dramatic message about it or ask for credit. I just stopped being the invisible subsidy, because sometimes revenge is the clean break from an unpaid job no one acknowledges you are doing, and the satisfaction is immediate and quiet and absolutely real. I also took myself off the group family plan for streaming and the cloud drive where I had stored every scanned document and receipt for them, because I realized I had become the administrator of a family that did not consider me an equal member. And I sent a single, cordial text that said I needed to reorganize my finances for the semester and would no longer be managing shared accounts, and if they needed copies of anything they could ask and I would send them, which read neutral but felt like a door sliding between us, smooth and final. To mark the line so even I could not pretend it was not there, I drove to their house with an envelope that held the spare key I had carried for years and a short note that simply said I am rooting for everyone to stand on their own. And I slid it through the mail slot and walked back to my car without looking over my shoulder, because I was not staging a scene, I was making a decision, and the decision was that my energy and my competence would no longer be available as a safety net they only felt when it was gone. By the time my phone pinged with a new message, a cheerful update about how relieved everyone felt that my brother could start fresh, without the weight of his own choices, I had already started looking at listings for remote work. Not the kind of gig you brag about at holidays, but the kind you can do at 2 in the morning while eating leftovers and building something no one sees coming. And if you are wondering whether that was the moment the plan began, the answer is that the plan had been writing itself inside me for years, and now I was finally reading it out loud. I did not tell them this, and I did not hint at it, and I did not post anything, because I had no interest in being inspirational or proving a point. I only wanted distance and a pay stub with my name on it, and the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thinking. And while they were busy congratulating my brother for stepping into adulthood with training wheels, I was busy removing mine in the only way that counted, which was to stop performing neediness for people who preferred me small. So when my mother asked on the phone later that week if I still needed help finding a cheaper place or if I wanted her to ask around at church for a roommate, I thanked her and said I had it covered, and she sounded surprised but not worried, which was perfect. Because for the first time I did not want them worried, I wanted them unaware, and as I hung up I smiled at the thought that the next time they discussed my situation, they would do it without any of the data, because the channel they had always used to track me just went dark. And that is where I will leave you for now, with the taste of a small revenge that set the table for everything that followed, because I did one more thing before the week ended, something I did not announce and did not explain. Something that made me feel a little reckless and a lot alive, and if you want to know what it was, you will need to hear how I found a job that paid me to vanish. When I say I found a job that paid me to vanish, I do not mean anything glamorous or suspicious. I mean the kind of remote contract that lives in the back end of the internet where people like me review messy workflows, clean up files, create the documents no one has time to build, and keep things moving while more visible people talk on calls about deliverables. And the only reason I got it was because a friend of a friend needed someone who could write clearly, think quickly, and stay awake at odd hours without complaining, which I could, because nothing makes you alert like the sound of your own life finally becoming yours. They onboarded me in a way that felt almost unreal after years of being told to tough it out, because they sent a simple agreement. They paid a reasonable rate, and they did not ask for a favor first. Which is how I learned that the difference between family and work is that work tends to pay you for what you actually do, while family sometimes pays for what they wish you were, and since I had never been paid for the job of being the responsible one at home, I let myself be paid for being responsible somewhere else entirely, and I set my hours around classes. I took the late shifts other people hated, and I discovered I could be useful without apologizing. Which is a kind of freedom you cannot understand until you stop waiting for someone to approve you. The tasks were not glamorous, but they were steady and they were honest, and because I am the kind of person who cannot help fixing broken things, I started building templates for them. Not the kind you show off on social media, just practical checklists, simple handoffs, and clean naming structures that made it impossible to lose track of what mattered. And the moment I sent the first package, I felt a calm I had not felt in years, because I was no longer rehearsing a speech for a parent who would find a way to misunderstand me. I was writing instructions for people who wanted to get through their week without dropping the ball, and the relief of being seen in the most ordinary way turned out to be addictive. A strange thing happened once the paycheck came in and the first bills were covered without drama, because instead of feeling safe, I felt something closer to permission, and I used that permission to make changes I had put off forever. Like opening a new email under my full name with my middle name spelled out, Not to be secretive in a shady way, but to create a clean door where no one from home would wander in and ask me to resend a document or fix a password at 3 in the morning, and then I set up a virtual mailbox because I was done being the default address for problems that belong to other people. And then I called my bank and added extra verification steps because all the little cracks where my time and patience had leaked out over the years looked different now that I had stepped back and seen them for what they were. You want to know how I disappeared without moving an inch, and I am telling you it was not a dramatic vanishing act. It was small, boring settings and choices that add up, like turning off read receipts, letting unknown calls go to voicemail, setting a rule that flagged every message from the family group and moved it into a folder I checked once a week on the same day I did laundry, because I had learned that emergencies have a way of shrinking when you stop treating them like alarms and start treating them like calendars, and the more I did this, the more I could feel my brain quieting, which made room for something else, something like strategy, something like the version of me they never bothered to imagine. The job changed within a few months, because while I was building those templates I kept spotting patterns, little places where someone was losing hours every week because a form did not make sense or a tracker was overcomplicated. And I started sending short notes with fixes, nothing fancy, just a way to stop the bleeding, and one day a manager asked if I would like to take on a bigger piece for an extra fee, and without announcing anything to anyone I said yes. And I used the extra money to build a small cushion, not much, but enough that I could breathe for the first time, which has a way of making you stand up straighter even when no one is watching. My mother called around then with a voice that sounded almost cheerful, the kind of tone people use when they are about to ask for something they have already decided you will give. And she said my brother was stressed and needed a little help with an upcoming payment since starting fresh was more complicated than anyone expected, and I almost said no on reflex, but then a different idea walked in, careful and calm. The way good ideas do when you are not trying to impress anyone, and I listened. To her described the situation, and I told her I would think about it and call her back, which I did not do right away because I had to build something first. What I built was simple and ruthless in a way that did not involve yelling or punishment, because I listed every errand, every ride, every late-night fix, every holiday task I had ever done. Not to send it as an invoice, but to remind myself of the unpaid job I had resigned, and I wrote a short message that would serve as my new policy, and the next morning I turned it into my real boundary, which I delivered with a calm that felt new in my mouth. And I told my mother I would help exactly once, and only through a formal transfer with a written agreement that he would pay it back in small amounts starting at a set time, and that if he missed those dates I would not chase. I would simply forward a copy of the agreement to him and to her, and then I would step back again. She hesitated, because fairness rarely sounds generous when you are used to imbalance, but she agreed, and I sent the agreement and the transfer with a memo line that said bridge, which felt clean to me because a bridge is meant to be crossed and left behind, not used as a campsite. And when the first repayment date came and went in silence, I did not call or nag or bend. I simply forwarded the original message to both of them with the subject that said per our agreement, and then I returned to my work without explaining myself, and the silence that followed was different from the old silence, because this time it was filled with my own life. Now for the small revenge you can taste and not just observe, because I promise myself every episode would end with something that makes me feel the ground under my feet. I wrote a gentle autoresponder for the family thread that said I was unavailable for household help and administrative tasks, and that future requests should be directed to my brother, who had been given a fresh start and therefore was the correct point of contact for errands, pickups, rides, and last-minute scrambles. And then I set the filter so that any message containing the words help, urgent, ride, print, or favor triggered that reply, and I went back to my spreadsheets with a smile that did not need an audience, because redirecting the labor to the person they had chosen to invest in felt the most honest thing I had done in years. If you are wondering whether this was the destination, it was not even close, because while I kept building templates and systems for other people, I started to see the outline of something I could own, not a grand idea, Just a repeatable service that solved the same headache across different teams, and I bought a cheap domain with my middle name and drafted a one-page pitch that I sent to exactly 3 people who had already liked the way I worked. And when 2 of them said yes, I realized I had taken the first steps toward something larger than a job. And if you want to know how far that something went and why my father ended up standing in a lobby he did not recognize, asking a receptionist if I worked there, you will have to hear how I turned a contractor login into a company without telling a soul. The strange thing about growing up in a family that constantly underestimates you is that once you finally stop trying to prove yourself to them, your energy becomes available for things you never imagined you had the capacity for. Because all those hours you used to spend replaying conversations in your head, trying to figure out if you said the wrong thing or could have explained yourself better, suddenly become available for actual work, and in my case that work started out as small, simple projects I picked up from people who barely knew my name, but who valued the way I delivered results without drama, excuses, or last-minute scrambling. And little by little those projects began to expand into something that looked suspiciously like the beginnings of a business. At first, I told myself I was just freelancing on the side, nothing official, nothing worth mentioning to anyone, but the more I organized workflows and delivered systems that saved people time, the more I realized they were willing to pay for consistency. And consistency was the one thing I had always been forced to cultivate, because when you grow up in a house where stability is reserved for one child while the other is told to make do, you either collapse or you develop the ability to show up every single time, no matter what, and I had chosen the latter. I built templates that could be resold. I created packages that made sense to clients who did not want to explain their problems twice, and I began to think less like an exhausted student trying to keep up and more like someone who had a long-term plan. Though I never said that out loud to anyone. Meanwhile, my brother was still orbiting the family in the same way he always had, dipping in and out of jobs, leaning on my parents whenever he slipped up, and posting things online about how tough the world was and how no one gave him a fair shot. Which was almost funny, because if anyone had been given a padded runway it was him, yet he had managed to stumble even with all the nets beneath him, while I had built a thin tightrope across the air and taught myself how to run on it without falling. I would occasionally get updates from my mother, usually in the form of subtle guilt, asking if I could maybe talk to him about discipline or help him polish a resume, and I learned to answer in a way that sounded polite but provided nothing. Because I had made the decision that my energy would never again be spent shoring up the very system that had starved me. The turning point came when one of my clients, a woman who ran a small consulting firm, asked me why I was not branding myself properly, because she said I was doing the work of an agency without calling it one, and at first I brushed it off as flattery. But later that night I sat with the idea and realized that she was right, because the systems I had built were not random one-offs. They were repeatable solutions that could be packaged, scaled, and sold under my name rather than borrowed through someone else's contract. I registered the domain with my middle name attached because it felt like the safest way to stay invisible, and I began operating under that brand, taking on clients carefully, one by one, while keeping my family in the dark. Because their opinions were not only unnecessary, but actively dangerous to my focus. What made this part so satisfying was not the money at first, though it was more than I had ever made in my life, but the knowledge that I was building something entirely outside of their control, something they could neither sabotage nor minimize because they did not even know it existed. My brother kept circling back to the same problems, and at one point my mother called me with a request that might have sounded reasonable to someone else, asking if I could spare a little cash to help him out of yet another mess. And for the first time in my life I said yes without resentment, because I had already mapped out exactly how it would play out. I drew up a formal agreement, nothing complicated, just a clean repayment schedule with terms that could not be bent, and I presented it to them with a calmness that threw them off, because I was not pleading or negotiating, I was simply setting terms. And when my brother missed the first installment, I did not chase or scold. I simply forwarded the agreement again with no commentary, which made the silence stretch out in a way that felt powerful. This was not about the money. It was about showing them that I no longer played the role of the reliable sister who cleaned up messes behind the scenes. The company continued to grow, mostly because I kept my head down and focused on building systems that actually worked rather than chasing recognition. I hired one contractor, then another, people who were better than me at certain tasks, and I made it clear that they were to be paid on time no matter what, because I refused to replicate the stinginess I had grown up around. What shocked me most was how quickly clients recommended me to others once they realized I was reliable, and soon I was juggling more work than I could handle alone, which meant my little side hustle had become something bigger than me, something I could not hide forever. But I did hide it, at least from my family, because every time my parents called it was the same script, them telling me about my brother's struggles, them hinting that I should come home for a while, them suggesting I find something stable, rather than cobbling together odd jobs, and I learned to nod along and keep the conversation short, because the last thing I wanted was to invite them into a space where they would inevitably try to take credit or claim influence. They still thought of me as the one barely scraping by, and that misperception became my shield, because it allowed me to build in peace while they kept celebrating my brother's empty promises. Now, here is where the quiet revenge sharpened again, because one evening when my mother called to talk about how worried she was about me, I listened without interruption, and then I told her that things were fine, better than fine, but that I preferred not to share details until I felt stable, which made her sigh dramatically and shift the conversation back to my brother, and I hung up realizing that I had created an invisibility cloak without even trying, because their refusal to believe in me had become the perfect cover for my growth. They were not watching me, and because they were not watching, they could not stop me, and that, to me, felt like the sweetest kind of payback. Still, the real revenge was not just in growing quietly, it was in planning the reveal, because even then, even as my company reached a point where I had an office space, a small team, and contracts that paid more in a month than my parents had ever offered me in a year, I knew that one day the truth would surface, not because I wanted to throw it in their faces, but because life has a way of arranging confrontations, and when it finally happened, I wanted to be ready, not scrambling for validation, but standing in a place I had built entirely on my own terms. And if you think that was the end, it was only the beginning of the setup, because soon enough my brother's failures and my parents' blind loyalty to him created the perfect stage for the kind of twist no one could have scripted. A twist I was already preparing for, because I knew in my bones that sooner or later they would come knocking, and when they did, the door they opened would not be the one they expected. By the time my so-called freelancing had solidified into a real company with a name, a legal registration, a small team, and contracts that kept growing in both size and seriousness, I had learned something that felt both liberating and quietly devastating. The less you tell certain people about your progress, the more they cling to the outdated version of you they are comfortable with, which in my case meant that while my parents were still imagining me hunched over a second-hand laptop, scraping together just enough to keep the lights on, I was running payroll for 2 part-timers, preparing to sign my first lease on an office space, and managing client lists that extended across multiple states. Their blindness became my camouflage, and I leaned into it, because as long as they kept picturing me as the one who struggled, I had free rein to build something far beyond what they could imagine. The irony, which never failed to make me smirk in private, was that my parents still called me with the same tone of weary concern, asking whether I was sure I could afford groceries or if I had considered moving home for a while to ease the burden. And they always segued into updates about my brother, updates that sounded suspiciously like damage control dressed up as optimism. He was trying out a new business idea. He was thinking of applying for a certification. He was making progress on getting serious. Each of these phrases was code for the same thing. He had made another mistake, they had covered it, and they were praying he would somehow stumble into competence. I let them talk. I murmured the expected, "That's good to hear," and all the while I was finalizing contracts that would cover my rent, my savings, and the next phase of expansion without breaking a sweat. The real setup, though, came when my mother asked me again if I could help him out, not with money this time, but with just a little guidance, and instead of brushing her off I said yes, which startled even me, because I had no intention of being his mentor or cleaning up his mess. What I wanted was leverage, and leverage sometimes requires patience. I offered to review one of his projects and help him outline a plan, which I did, but I built that plan in such a way that it depended entirely on his follow-through. I made sure there were no shortcuts, no rescue hatches, no ways to fudge the deadlines, because I knew him well enough to know he would fail, and I wanted the failure to land squarely where it belonged. When, predictably, he ignored the plan and fell behind almost immediately, my mother called in a panic, saying he was overwhelmed, and I responded with calm professionalism, sending her a copy of the plan and pointing out that the steps were simple and achievable, and that accountability was part of the process. I said it kindly, but firmly, the way I would talk to a client who was trying to wriggle out of their responsibilities, and for the first time in my life, I watched her flinch at the sound of her own excuses collapsing. That was my quiet revenge, treating her favorite child not as a victim of circumstance, but as a grown man responsible for his own choices and refusing to be drafted into the role of fixer. Meanwhile, I poured my actual energy into scaling the company, which had reached the point where hiding it entirely was becoming difficult, not because I wanted to tell anyone, but because success leaves traces. Contracts had to be signed under my company's name, invoices were going out with a logo attached, and eventually one of my mother's acquaintances stumbled across my website while searching for a service we offered. When she mentioned it to my mother, my phone rang within the hour. "What is this business you're running? Why didn't you say anything?" she asked, in a tone that mixed accusation with disbelief. I smiled as I answered her, explaining that it was just a small project, nothing worth discussing, and that I preferred to keep things quiet until I was sure it would last. She let it drop, but I could hear the unease in her voice, as though she had glimpsed a version of me she could not fully comprehend. And this is where the true setup crystallized. I began to prepare not just for success, but for the eventual confrontation. I made decisions not with my family in mind, but with the inevitability that one day they would walk into my world without realizing it was mine. I tightened systems, polished presentations, and made sure that everything a client saw projected competence, authority, and permanence, because I wanted no cracks in the facade when the moment came. My revenge was not going to be a shouted, "I told you so." It was going to be the unshakable reality that I had built something undeniable, and that they had no part in it. I also started to pull back from personal communication more aggressively, because every request they sent, every hint that I should check in on my brother, every plea for me to help, just this once, was met with polite redirection. I no longer explained, I no longer justified, I no longer softened my refusals. Instead, I leaned on a tone I had mastered through work, professional, courteous, final. And with every redirection, with every clean no, I felt myself tightening the stage lights for the eventual scene, the one where they would finally realize they had misjudged me not once or twice, but consistently, for years. The setup had one final layer, and it was the most satisfying of all. I hired a receptionist. Not just because I needed one, though I did, but because I knew how symbolic it would be when the time came. I wanted there to be someone in the lobby, a gatekeeper who did not know my family history, who would treat them the same as any other visitors, which meant politely, firmly, without indulgence. I wanted them to feel the same distance that every client felt when they walked in off the street, because only then would they understand that they no longer held the privilege of assuming access to me. And that really is the essence of this episode. The revenge here was not dramatic or explosive, it was architectural. I was building a stage where they would one day find themselves standing, completely unaware that the script had been written by me years in advance. I did not rush it, I did not force it, I simply let the structure rise brick by brick, confident that sooner or later fate would deliver them to my door. Which, as it turned out, is exactly what happened. Because years later, long after they had stopped asking where I lived, long after they had stopped pretending to know what I was doing, long after they had convinced themselves that my brother's endless, fresh starts were still the story worth investing in, my father walked into a building with my company's name on the directory, leaned on the reception desk, and asked if his daughter worked there. And the receptionist, who had no idea who he was, looked right past him at me. But to explain what happened in that moment, you'll have to wait, because that, finally, is where the payoff lands. I walked in on an ordinary weekday with my head already in the list for the day, thinking about contracts that needed signatures and a messy handoff I planned to fix before lunch, and I saw my father at the reception desk, leaning forward in that careful, reasonable posture he uses when he is about to ask for something he has already decided he deserves, and I heard him ask our receptionist if his daughter worked here, and for a beat everything inside me went very quiet, not from shock or anger, but from the sort of recognition that comes when the past and the present finally stand in the same room and refuse to pretend they do not know each other. I did not rescue the moment or rush to make it easy, because I had built this place not to perform worthiness, but to do work that mattered, and I wanted the building to do what I designed it to do, hold the line for me, even with him. I nodded to our receptionist and she understood immediately, because good people who guard the door know how to buy you a few clean seconds when you need them. And she asked him to sign the visitor book and fill out the short intake card that lists the reason for the visit and whether there is a conflict of interest. And I stood to the side and watched a man who once told me a precedent would be dangerous write my name in a box on a form that demanded clarity. When she called me Ms. Hart and asked if I could spare a few minutes for an unannounced visitor, I said yes in the same neutral tone I use for everyone, because I wanted the tone to do the work I did not feel like explaining. And I walked him back to a small conference room that is intentionally plain and unmemorable, not to diminish anyone, but to keep conversations about people and decisions and accountability instead of distractions. And when the door shut, he finally looked fully at me as if a light had been turned toward a person he had not bothered to examine for years, and he said my name as a question, like I might confirm that I was in fact the person he used to know. He started with the obvious line, the one people use when they have not earned your time, asking why I had not told them what I was doing and whether I was safe and whether I could have used advice. And instead of going to war with all the old arguments, I let a very simple truth sit between us, telling him I had learned more than once that asking for help in our family translated to being told to try harder, and that I had eventually taken the lesson so seriously I stopped asking entirely, which turned out to be the only thing that worked. He took that in, and then he tried to pivot to the reason he was there, which was exactly what I expected. He said my mother had heard things, that a friend had mentioned my company, that my brother could use a hand landing on his feet again, and that it might be good for everyone if I could find a place for him, or at least put in a word, because family should take care of its own, a phrase that has been used on me like a leash my entire life. I did not raise my voice or plead my case, and I did not itemize what I had carried for years, because I had already done that work and it had nothing left to teach me. So I slid a slim folder across the table and told him this was the only word I had to offer, which was our policy that bars nepotism and requires a standard application like everyone else, with the additional clause that any applicant with a direct tie to leadership must go through an extra panel and meet a higher bar to avoid bias, all of which is boring and fair and non-negotiable, and he stared at the page as if it had betrayed him personally. He asked if I was serious, and I said that I was, and I added that if my brother wanted to interview, he could follow the posted process and demonstrate value without shortcuts, because the fastest way to teach a person to stand up is to stop laying out cushions before they fall, and I told him I would have no involvement in the decision and would not be in the room, and that even if he passed the panel there would be a probation period like every other hire, and if he failed he would be out like every other hire, and if he passed I would expect him to report to a manager who would not take my calls on his behalf. He tried to smile in that way he uses when he is trying to reset the scene, and he said it would mean a lot to the family if I could just make this one exception. I told him exceptions were how we broke everything good, and that I no longer traded my integrity for peace at dinner. He shifted then, because when flattery does not work people reach for memory, and he said he wished I had told them I needed help back when I was struggling, and he said they would have done more if they had known how hard it was. And I let him finish the line because I did not want to take from him the one story that lets him sleep, but I also did not rescue him from the truth, which is that they knew enough and made choices anyway, and that those choices were their right, and that my life is now the result of mine. He looked at me like a man who just realized the door he kept closed for years does not open anymore, not because the lock is broken, but because the building has new owners and new rules. And then he asked the question that mattered. Do you work here? I could have laughed or lectured or shown him every milestone he missed, but that would have put me back in the worst job I ever held, which was trying to translate myself to people who preferred me misread. So I gave him the cleanest version of the answer, telling him that I own the company, that the name on the lease and the accounts and the payroll is mine, and that I am responsible for the employees he walked past and the clients whose work pays those employees, and that the person he came looking for as a favor is the person who signs the checks. And for a long moment he said nothing, which was the closest thing to an apology I have ever received. I did not leave the scene there, because the finale needed one more turn, not cruelty, just elegance, so I slid a second page across the table. A standard services agreement that outlined a package my team offers to struggling small operators who need real structure and accountability, with a retainer due up front and clear deliverables that could help my brother if he ever decided to stop rehearsing failure. And I told my father that if he wanted my help, this was how it came now, not as unpaid labor, not as after-hours emotional rescue, but as paid, scheduled work with boundaries, receipts, and deadlines. And I added that if he signed right, then I would assign a project manager by the end of the week. And if he did not sign, there was nothing else to discuss, because the era of me fixing things quietly was over. He looked at the agreement, and then he looked at me, and he understood exactly what the offer meant, which is that the door was not closed out of spite. It was closed because I finally learned to value my time and the people who rely on me. And that if he wanted in, he would have to come through the same entrance as everyone else and sit in the same chairs and say the same words and follow the same rules. He did not sign, not that day, because pride is a complicated habit to quit, and that was fine, because the point was never to win a scene, it was to end a long story the right way. I stood, thanked him for coming, and walked him back to the lobby where a receptionist handed him a printed copy of the policy he had just read. And when he said he would think about it, I said that was fair. And when he asked if he could call me later, I told him scheduling goes through the front desk now, which is our process for every visitor. And then I turned to the work I had planned to do before I saw him. Because the most honest revenge I can offer is to keep building what they could not imagine without asking permission, and to let them learn, in their own time, that the daughter who stopped asking did not disappear. She simply outgrew the place where asking was required.